Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to Scaling Up Virtual Live. That's good morning across the Americas and good afternoon in Europe and beyond. My name is Jeff Passmore, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the fourth in our series of 8 weekly Scaling Up Live webinars. This entire series of webinars is sponsored by our platinum sponsor, EcoStrat, as most of you know, North America's biomass supply chain experts. You may not be aware that EcoStrat has sourced and supplied over 5 million tons of wood fiber and organic feedstock in markets across North America. And today's webinar is hosted by Iogen Corporation, a global leader in developing technology to make clean burning, renewable cellulosic biofuels. Now, I have a few housekeeping messages. First of all, if you're having any problems with the audio, check your audio settings by clicking the audio button on Zoom. If you have a Bluetooth device connected, we recommend turning off your Bluetooth while on Zoom. And in the unlikely event you experience any major interference, a new Zoom link will be sent to you and the meeting will resume in 5 minutes. As a registered participant, your video capabilities are disabled and you will be automatically muted. The entire webinar is being recorded and all registrants will be sent a recording following the end of today's session. Just a reminder to panelists who are not speaking, probably a good idea to mute your microphones until it's your time to present. And most importantly for the participants, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom page. Do not use the chat box. We won't be monitoring the chat box for questions. We'll only be monitoring the Q&A box. And in the event you need any technical assistance, you can send an email to Jake. His email address at AJW is there on the bottom of that screen. Now, we've got a really great panel today. We've got Brian Foody, the CEO of Iogen, coming to us from Ottawa, Canada, and we have 3 Americans, Michelle Passero from the Nature Conservancy, and who's from California, Debbie Reed from Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, who's from Virginia, and of course our session host, Mary Solecki, a partner at AJW, who's just outside Sacramento. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you all, and over to you, Mary, and your panel.
Great, thank you so much, Jeff, and good morning, everybody. Here on the West Coast, so still sipping a little bit of coffee, but very glad to be with you all. And as Jeff said, I'm Mary Solecki. I am a partner at AJW, which is a government affairs consulting firm. We're based in both Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, California. I am joined by a wonderful panel here today to talk about the bioeconomy and its role in helping address climate change. And so I would like to introduce my panelists. We've got Brian Foody with Iogen Corporation. We have Michelle Passero with the Nature Conservancy and Debbie Reed with Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. Brian, I believe that we're going to start things off with you. So if you would like to go ahead and get your, I believe you have slides, right?
Sure, I do have a few slides. So Jake, can you kick it off?
And Jake, should we keep our videos live while?
I guess I should just kick it off, Mary. Does that work?
That sounds great. Thanks, Brian.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mary and Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here at Scaling Up 2020 to talk about the role of the industrial bioeconomy in addressing climate change. Next step. So let me just kick this off with my core thesis. The industrial bioeconomy will be crucial to addressing the transportation sector's impact on climate change. Next slide. But let me just start off with an introduction to who Iogen is. We're one of the top 5 registered producers of cellulosic biofuels. Cellulosic biofuels are sort of the Uber fuels for Uber biofuels for sustainability. We do about 30 million gallons a year, and we work with a whole host of large companies. Next slide, please. We've also been a long-time developer in cellulosic biofuels. We've been active since the 70s, particularly working with cellulosic ethanol, and we've had a number of partnerships with a whole set of major companies. Next slide. So now, how can the bioeconomy affect GHG emissions? Fundamentally, when you think about the bioeconomy, it's driven by the ability of plants to capture CO2 from the atmosphere, essentially to sequester it. So think about this cycle. You start off with a plant growing, it draws CO2 out of the atmosphere. In the case of a biofuel, that plant is converted in an industrial biofuel facility into a fuel and then run in a car. This slide is copied from a Volkswagen slide, but there are many around. And you can see that the process of running a biofuel bears a real similarity to the cycle that mimics the natural cycle of growth and decay in the atmosphere. Of course, there are questions about whether there's other fossil fuels that come into the play, but fundamentally, this is what the bioeconomy can do for fuels, operate within the natural cycle. Next slide. So to see the bioeconomy in action, let's go to California. This chart shows how California's low carbon fuel standard is intended to bring down CO2 emissions in the transportation sector. So what you can see on the x-axis, first of all, is the year. It stretches from 2011 all the way out to 2030. And on the y-axis, the target down at the lower right-hand corner is to achieve a 20% reduction in transportation CO2 emissions by 2030. And the green line shows you that we're on track now and running at the pace we need to hit those targets. Next slide. There's a missing piece here. Jake, could you go back? Okay, I'm going to have to do a soft shoe because you can't see this slide that I happen to be looking at. I'm not sure what happened. But basically, biofuels are generating the lion's share of CO2 savings. You can take my word for it that if you saw what I had intended for you to see, there would be a steep stair step up in the growth of biofuels from ethanol to renewable diesel to biodiesel, generating LCFS credits. As it happens, conventional corn ethanol doesn't have the lowest carbon intensity of fuels, and the biggest contributor of all biofuels is renewable diesel, which has been growing very rapidly. Another component, you might call one of the cleanest of the components, is biomethane, and it produces, it's the space that we're in. Next slide, please. This next chart just basically outlines the kind of difference that these fuels make. Renewable diesel, which is the one at the top, all the way at the right is where fossil fuels would be, all the way at the left is zero emissions. You can see that renewable diesel has maybe a 40 to 50% reduction. This particular chart shows every individual fuel facility that the California Air Resources Board has approved. Both renewable diesel and biodiesel make big reductions. Even ethanol, the lowest of the three, has big improvements. Next slide, please. And then if you look to maybe I'll call it less conventional fuels, along the bottom line is biomethane. And you'll see that not only can it deliver zero emissions, there's a number of operating facilities that have negative emissions due to the fact that they're not only capturing CO2, but capturing methane in their process and reducing methane emissions to the atmosphere. In fact, this is the space Iogen is active in, and we are the largest credit generator in that space. Next slide, please. Now, I'm sure you've all heard about the future of EVs. It's just worth saying the bioeconomy's impact is very material. So California's goal for 2030 is 5 million EVs on the road by 2030. You can see that the scale of the impact that they're anticipating from low carbon fuels, primarily biofuels in the marketplace, by 2030 is that and larger. Next slide. You might say, how much of a difference could biofuels make? This is an old slide prepared a long time ago, but the message is continued. biofuels have the resources, particularly if you look to biomass feedstocks, for making huge differences in the overall consumption of transportation fuels from petroleum-based sources. Next slide. So finally, even in a 100% EV world, biofuels still have an important role. This chart from the California Air Resources Board shows what would happen with a transition to EVs, 100% transition to EVs in 2034. Even 15, 20 years later, there's material amounts of gasoline use, fuel use, whose emissions can only be captured by having low emission fuels. Next slide. And of course, we can't forget about aviation and heavy transportation, for which electricity isn't a major part. So finally, next slide. My core thesis again, the industrial bioeconomy will be crucial in addressing the transportation sector's impact on climate change. I hope it's been a convincing brief story. And thank you very much. And over to you, Mary.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brian. Really appreciate that view of biofuels and their role within the bioeconomy. Something I should have mentioned at the top, I apologize, is that the speaker bios are available in the conference materials. So if you would like to learn a little bit more about the backgrounds of any of our panelists, please feel free to take a peek over in the conference materials. So next up, we're going to be hearing from Michelle. She's going to talk a little bit more about the forestry role within the bioeconomy. And I'll pass it over to you, Michelle.
Great, thank you very much. Really appreciate being a part of this session. I'm Michelle Passero. I lead our climate program here in Smoky, California. So please, next slide. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Nature Conservancy, we are a global nonprofit organization with over 1 million members, and our mission, we're dedicated to protecting the lands and waters upon which all life depends. And we see climate change as a lead threat to our public mission. We also believe that markets and nature can play a key role in helping to address climate change. Next slide. Some of my colleagues have done quite a bit of scientific research on the role that nature-based climate strategies can play in helping us meet the Paris Agreement to keep temperatures well below a 2-degree increase by mid-century. One global analysis that we did has found that roughly 1/3 of the reductions that we need could come from a variety of nature-based strategies, anywhere from land conservation to changes in land management to restoration. And this is across all land types. So we're talking about agriculture, wetlands, forests, and even urban forests. We've done similar analysis here for California, where we find that on a cumulative level, about 500 million metric tons of reductions could be achieved by mid-century through a variety of these practices. Next slide. Brian already spoke a little bit about California's climate action. Just to go over it briefly, California has a couple goals that are set in statute to reduce emissions overall. We had a 2020 goal to reduce emissions 25% below 1990 levels, which California has met and even exceeded. We also have a 2030 goal, which is a 40% reduction below 1990 levels. And by executive order, there's a state goal to reach carbon neutrality by 2045. California has a cap on emissions across all major emitting sectors, and numerous policies really have been enacted to help achieve this goal. And there is an emerging interest here in California, and I'd say similarly globally, in finding ways for nature or land management and restoration strategies to also play a key role as part of this solution. Next slide. There are a number of market-based approaches that we are particularly interested in at the Nature Conservancy to help us use nature-based strategies to help meet our climate goals here in California as well as globally. Brian touched upon the low carbon fuel standard. So this is one mechanism for creating markets that could help us not only reduce the carbon intensity of fuels, but could also help us on the land side in designing land management strategies that can actually help us restore carbon even to soil and vegetation and improve soil health. And I imagine Debbie may speak to this a bit more. We are also interested in biomass energy as a way to help us restore forest health in using the material to help create renewable energy, but at the same time reducing fire risk and also just restoring better balance to our forests. The insurance market is another area that there's quite a bit of discussion here in California with our insurance commissioner on finding ways to use nature-based strategies and maybe insuring things like wetlands or even reefs as a way to protect communities against climate impacts. So this is an emerging area. And then certainly many of you may be familiar with California's cap and trade program, where it's an economy-wide cap and emission permits are auctioned in part and also given to capped industries to use to reduce trade over time. And as part of this cap and trade program, investments of offsets are also permitted. So investments in activities like land management and forest land management is an option to reduce emissions. And let's go to the next slide. The cap and trade program now is extended to 2030 by statute. The offsets are one set of provisions. This is where the forest offsets and improved forest management and restoration and conservation come in. The permits are auctioned quarterly in California, which produces another revenue stream. And it has produced billions of dollars that have been reinvested in the economy into greenhouse gas reductions and projects that help us also address climate risk. And many of you may be familiar with the linkage between California's program and Quebec, where each jurisdiction does share joint auctions and observes the allowances that are auctioned off to jointly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. So a little bit more on the forest offset protocols. Offsets are permitted throughout the continental United States, and the activities where credits are issued include improved forest management, avoiding conversion, so avoiding the conversion of open forested areas to more urbanized uses, as well as reforestation. So for instance, planting after a fire or where land had been converted historically, but was once forest. Those are the kinds of activities that can be credited. There are protocols, regulatory standardized protocols that the state has adopted to guide how these offsets are developed and credited over time. As of September, about 165 million credits have been issued to a variety of forest projects. Improved forest management is the predominant one that has received the most credits among the forest activities. And there are projects throughout the US that have been developed and continue to be developed. Next slide. And just as an example, one project here in California is an improved forest management project. It's called the Buckeye Forest. It's roughly 20,000 acres in size, and this it's a mixed, what we call mixed conifer forest. So it includes redwoods and Douglas fir, as well as some grassland. This project both avoided conversion to vineyards and housing development, so it limited that pretty significantly. but it also is a managed forest. Certain components of this acreage is dedicated to improve timber management. So the reductions are coming from both avoiding emissions from avoiding conversion, but also increased carbon sequestration through changes in forest management over time. It is accruing greenhouse gas reductions at roughly 100,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent annually. And to date, offsets have been sold and have earned roughly $6.8 million. What's unique about this project too is that the revenue is actually being shared between the nonprofit organization, the Conservation Fund, who owns the property, and a state agency, the California Coastal Conservancy. The Coastal Conservancy had funded part of this acquisition, and so as part of this transaction, there is a revenue sharing agreement where the Conservation Fund is receiving a percentage of those proceeds, but also some of that funding is being returned to the state agency, which then is also in turn being used to invest in other land conservation projects. So it's actually an interesting example showing how offsets are being produced to improve forest management, but also from as a transaction side, how there's being the shared revenue that goes that actually can help reinvest in different land management and conservation projects, and also being returned to the landowner as well. And there is also a conservation easement across the property, which is also an added financial incentive, frankly, to the landowner. And next slide. Okay, so I'm happy to answer questions later on, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. We're already getting some good questions in the chat box from folks, so thank you. Please continue to populate that as questions may come up, and we'll have an opportunity for discussion. But first, we're going to be hearing from Debbie, and she's going to be talking a little bit more about the ag sector and its role in the bioeconomy. We'll give it a moment to come up.
Thank you, Mary. Just pulling up my slide deck. I was errant in sending it, so let me jump right into it. No problem. Thank you. So I'm the Executive Director of the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium and our research arm, which is the Research Consortium. And I really appreciate the remarks of my colleagues in helping to tee this up. I want to start by focusing specifically on agriculture, but also the fact that scientists globally have indicated we are no longer in a position to pick and choose which mitigation options we invest in and deploy. We really have to deploy all of the above to get ourselves to a point in terms of bringing down atmospheric concentration so that we can mitigate catastrophic impacts. The red line here on this slide shows business as usual, and the blue line shows how we get to avoiding catastrophic impacts by 2100. And the point I want to make here is we need to reduce emissions from all sectors and also remove emissions. And there are some sectors, agriculture and forestry and the bioeconomy in particular, that actually lend themselves to that. So in terms of the role of agriculture in reducing greenhouse gases, agriculture can help with reducing emissions, so meeting that blue gap, if you will. But also, as a sink, agriculture can remove and store carbon dioxide, and Michelle pointed to this, in plants, but mostly in soils. And the soil sink is actually the largest sink that we have. We have great opportunities to return carbon to that sink. The incredible benefit is that by doing that, particularly within agriculture and natural ecosystems, you actually improve the resilience of those systems so that we can help communities, but also producers who are doing business outdoors, adapt to extreme weather impacts, including floods and droughts. So I'll talk a little bit about agriculture and what we know. In the United States, agriculture is responsible for 10% of US greenhouse gas emissions, and globally for 11% if you take out the role of forestry. And as I indicated, agriculture is both a source and a sink. This slide shows really that all agricultural production systems are both sources and opportunities for us to mitigate. So whether you're talking about methane from livestock or carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, or methane from grazing land and cropland, we have real opportunities to reduce here. This slide shows trends going back in time to 1990. And what you see is emissions from livestock have been going up in the United States. Emissions from cropland have been going up. Grazing land, you see, in some years, in 2000, for instance, grazing land was a net sink. We have a real opportunity here to reverse that and improve that sink opportunity for both grazing land and cropland and reduce livestock emissions as well. So what are the keys to scaling ag as a climate change solution? The first and foremost is really producer economics. Farmers and ranchers are farming first and foremost, and they're businesses. And if the business of climate change mitigation doesn't work for them, we can't hope to scale. So our focus as an organization is that economic piece and making sure the opportunities work for them. That includes providing tools and resources for farmers and ranchers. And that's another thing that we as an organization have focus on, is what are those tools we can provide to the sector so they can participate with us. Another key is public-private partnerships working across the entire agricultural supply chain and value chain. And this is where we have been focused, is bringing together the entire agricultural supply chain and value chain to really create those tools, create the opportunities, and make sure that we can scale. And that brings me to my last point, which is that finance is an important part. And our theory of change is we can bring the markets as a opportunity to really help scale agricultural greenhouse gas mitigation opportunities. So now I'll talk a couple of minutes about ESMC and who we are. We were started in 2017 really to focus on how do we use markets to scale not only soil health systems, which are the very basis of agricultural productivity, but also all agricultural production systems so that we can improve their outcomes and benefit society, with climate change being the primary focus and thus carbon being the primary focus. We did it by really looking at how markets have operated and how they're operating now, and what are the shortcomings, where are the risks, and why haven't they scaled in terms of their ability to offset emissions. And then we designed and conceived a market exclusively for agriculture and designed to recognize and reward farmers, give them the tools they need to operate, but also ensuring that we make this a scalable, cost-effective market. If there's one slide that's important for this entire discussion, it's this one. This slide represents our members who are co-investing in this market with us, both the operational side as well as the research side. And you'll see it includes major agricultural companies like ADM, Bunge, Cargill, but also Corteva, Nestle, Danone, McDonald's, Tyson's. But then also research organizations, agricultural production organizations like National Corn Growers, National Academy of Beef, American Soy, land-grant universities, but also not members, but organizations that also participate with us, U.S. Department of Agriculture and U.S. Department of Energy, and then major NGOs. And the Nature Conservancy, hats off to Michelle and her organization, are not only founding members of ESMC, but one of our best partners on the ground helping us to scale this opportunity. So we're building the market, we're testing it, we're doing everything together with these organizations who are co-investing in the build out and the kicking of the tires, if you will, with us. And again, this is really incredibly important because it is one aspect that has been missing from current and existing markets is building the markets, building the opportunities with everyone at the table to make sure it works with them. One question to answer is, why are corporations and buyers interested in what we're doing? It's because we all share in the risk. If agriculture fails, if the impacts of agriculture are such that farmers and ranchers fail, we all fail. And there's an entire suite of industries for whom agriculture is a part of their supply chain that they have to source ingredients from, that are dependent on agriculture succeeding for them to succeed. So these are all of the industries that are impacted and for whom ensuring agriculture benefits from mitigation opportunities and can participate in those mitigation opportunities are important. And our buyers come from within these sectors. How do we work? This is just a quick slide. We're really the agent of change in the middle, creating this market opportunity. And we're providing the tools and the opportunities for market actors, whether you're a buyer or a supplier or a project developer in the middle, or a conservation NGO, to participate in the market and to help us scale the impacts. We enroll the producers, we then quantify, verify, and certify the outcomes, working with the global certification body Gold Standard and Sustain Cert. And then we stack the credits, we sell them, and we pay the farmers and ranchers. The credits that we generate in our approach include soil carbon credits as well as net greenhouse gas credits. So soil carbon is just looking at that removal, that sink opportunity. Net greenhouse gases is how we can reduce not only CO2, but methane and nitrous oxide. We also generate and sell improved water quality credits and water use conservation credits. And as the little bee icon shows, we're now working on a biodiversity credit due to demand from our members who are very interested in that. This quick slide just shows where we are working right now. The blue and the green stars show where we have launched or where we are launching pilots right now. The yellow are where we're planning. We've built out our protocol according to the 12 regions on this slide that you'll see. Just to dive in a little bit here, we started our first pilot in January of 2019 on 2 ranches in the Southern Great Plains. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. The ranchers there are both engaged in adaptive multi-paddock grazing, and in that region, continuous grazing is actually the predominant or prevailing practice. When we enroll producers in our program, we do take soil carbon samples, and we take them every 5 years so that we can both model and measure changes in soil carbon, which is really important for market credibility and market integrity. And this just shows on one of the ranches back in January where we were sampling using a Giddings 3-inch soil core. We sampled down to either 30 or 60 centimeters, which is 60 centimeters is important in some of these native grassland regions where you really get deep carbon sequestration happening. And I'm happy to answer any questions about our program as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Debbie, and appreciate everybody being so efficient with their presentations too. That gives us plenty of time for Q&A. We're getting a lot of good questions within the Q&A box. Please feel free to submit others. It's down in the lower right-hand side of your screen, assuming it's in the same place for you as it is for me. But again, put it into the Q&A section, not over into the chat if possible. And that's how I'm going to try to stay organized here. So to start the discussion, I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to pose to all 3 of the panelists. And I guess let me start with a pretty general question, which would be, what technology or policy advancements are needed from your perspective to help further drive the bioeconomy from either the sectors that you have talked about here today, or even more broadly about the bioeconomy? Anybody have any initial thoughts about technology or policy advancements? Debbie?
I can start. So in our research arm, we're actually investing in tools and technologies to make this more scalable. So soil carbon sequestration, it's the bright shiny object we're all interested in right now because of that removal possibility. But soil carbon sampling is very expensive. You saw the machine on the back of a truck, right? It's costly, it's time and resource expensive or intensive. We're investing in handheld tools and spectrometers and other technology where you can actually take soil carbon samples out in the field, maybe even ultimately put those tools in the hands of the farmer and rancher so that we can actually improve quantification approaches. But then we're also investing in things like remote sensing and satellite imagery, where we can also track practices and practice change and really have a better, more cost-effective, scalable way to track change across the horizon and link it to our ability to better quantify what's happening. I didn't talk about we're outcomes-based, but we're very focused on what is the actual impact, right? We're not focused on practices, we're focused on outcomes. So we're investing in technologies to really give us a better ability to quantify impacts across soil carbon, net greenhouse gases, and then water, and ultimately biodiversity as well.
I'll just, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Michelle. I'll follow.
Okay, it's just tagging on to what Debbie was saying. And I, along the same lines, I think we need to find a way to make sure we're engaging smaller landowners. You know, just in seeing how the carbon markets have played out in California, the larger landowners have greater capacity to engage. And so finding ways to make it easier for smaller landowners to engage in markets and activities that are climate friendly will be key. So, you know, taking advantage of technology. Also, I think looking at larger scale ways of doing the accounting and the monitoring, where maybe you're shifting the burden of some of those responsibilities to a program or the government, where landowners can report on what they're doing, but not necessarily have to shoulder the burden of doing all of the technical monitoring and inventory that is really needed. So it's synergistic with what Debbie is saying, and I just think we can try to find other ways also of doing the accounting and monitoring that can help bring in those smaller landowners.
And I would say the immediate thing that comes to mind is just seeing California's low carbon fuel standard expand across broader areas and see more jurisdictions adopt it. It provides a very market-oriented signal that helps both the construction of new low carbon infrastructure as well as incents innovation to make these things even more efficient. It's pushing the ethanol industry towards lower emissions and the biodiesel, renewable diesel industry in that direction. So I think if there was going to be a single policy thing, I would say that would be it. And I think that the best incentive for technologies is oftentimes through policies that create market signals for their adoption.
Great, thanks all. And just to, while we're on the topic of the low carbon fuel standard, I see that there's a question just about the value of a carbon credit in California at this point. And perhaps I could point to both Michelle and Brian to answer for cap and trade and LCFS respectively.
I could say for LCFS credits, they run about $200 a ton now. It's brought a lot of new market and new changes into the marketplace. Whether that's sustainable or not, we'll see. It just depends on the drive of developers.
And Michelle, the approximate prices on the auctions?
You know, for offset credits, it tends to be just under what the allowances are. And I mean, the last I heard, you know, it could be right around $14. It's a big difference with LCFS, but, you know, maybe around $14 a ton, give or take a couple dollars.
Yep, and there are a lot of good reasons for the differences in those prices, because one is economy-wide and one is very targeted towards the transportation sector. And that the transportation sector needs a much larger price signal to drive change. So Debbie, a question for you. How widespread is the bioeconomy among farmers in the US? Is it still a niche discussion among early adopters, or do you think that this is starting to spread into all farming communities? Can you give us a sense of that?
That's a very good question. I would say the discussion itself is much more widespread than it was 3 or 5 years ago. And a big reason for that is because of supply chain pressure, which, you know, if you looked at that slide with our members for whom agriculture is a part of their supply chain are very focused on how they reduce their footprints, how they meet obligations and commitments they've established for their corporate goals. And so they're talking to their suppliers, who are the farmers and ranchers. So the conversation itself has really grown. The actual engagement and enrollment in markets is right now relegated to mostly the innovators, the early adopters, those folks for whom risk and change, they're tolerant to it and tend to be the folks who are try it. The problem we have in markets is the additionality requirements don't allow those early adopters and those innovators largely to participate or get paid. So it's getting beyond that and engaging farmers and ranchers for whom they have not yet made practice changes that we really need to get to. And that is where focusing on the role and the voices of those innovators and early adopters is incredibly important, but also making it easy and providing the tools so that they can do this cost effectively.
Thanks, Debbie. A question for Brian is, how do you see the hydrogen economy working with the bioeconomy and tackling transportation sector emissions? I also saw a question about geothermal. So if you want to talk about hydrogen and to any extent that you might have a geothermal component to your answer, that would be appreciated. You're on mute, Brian.
Thank you. Sure. Of course, there's a number of ways to generate hydrogen. You often hear about electrolysis and sunlight as being a common approach, but the bioeconomy also delivers a route through the production of renewable natural gas and then steam methane reforming to renewable hydrogen. I would say that in terms of the, and then in terms of the use of the hydrogen, you could have hydrogen used as direct firing in vehicles, or you could have it used as in co-processing in a refinery. It turns out that a good chunk of the energy, 5% or thereabouts, in gasoline or diesel actually comes from hydrogen, which is incorporated into the basic backbone of the hydrocarbon as these fuels are made. My general view would be that the first route we're going to see to really a material scale in the hydrogen economy will be the bioeconomy being the source of hydrogen through some form of renewable natural gas or biogas, and that we'll see co-processing as the first line of implementation. Over time, of course, we'll probably move more in the direction of direct use of hydrogen and potentially even electricity-based hydrogen. There are obviously circumstances where you have very low-cost electricity. Geothermal energy can give you those opportunities if it's very high temperature, and any form of really low-cost electricity generation gives one an opportunity to generate cost-effective hydrogen.
Great. Any thoughts on the role of geothermal within the bioeconomy from anyone? I know that this is still a nascent market, so there may well be not much of an answer at this point, which is, I think, would answer the question that the participant raised.
I wouldn't have much to add.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So over to Michelle for a question. The problem with carbon offsets is that it still allows emitters to continue. There are also major issues with some initiatives of this type, In some developing countries where local people have been displaced from their land by authorities and military to put in carbon offset plantations. What can you say about this?
Well, for the cap and trade program, what I personally like what California has done is that it's one among many policies that are being implemented to drive down greenhouse gas emissions. And so the cap and trade program does provide the assurance of that economy-wide cap that declines over time. And so that acts as a backstop for emission reductions for the state to achieve its goal. But there are also other policies like the low carbon fuel standard. We have a renewable portfolio standard. So there's a whole slew of policies that are actually working to reduce emissions and have done so successfully for California. And so I think that is a nice model to replicate. So cap and trade is not the only policy solution to climate change. There is a declining cap overall, so that will assure emissions will come down over time, even though there is this cap and trade and an investment in offsets. And also there's a limitation on the amount of offsets that are permissible within the program. And so those are some of the safeguards or rules and design rules that are part of the program that help ensure that overall greenhouse gas emissions come down. As far as being careful about the production of offsets in international jurisdictions and tropical jurisdictions, I think we do need to be careful about how investments are made. There's been an evolution over time, especially in those tropical forest jurisdictions. There are third-party certification standards. And there's also things have migrated from a very small project scale approach to getting the buy-in of jurisdictions. And so they call it kind of jurisdictional accounting. So that means you have kind of the support of the government and some commitments that are being made that overall both environmental and social safeguards are met, as well as greenhouse gas reductions are monitored. In California, recently endorsed what we call a tropical forest standard. It doesn't mean that California's program actually accepts offsets from tropical forest jurisdictions right now, but it has a lot of good criteria embedded in that standard that helps address some of the issues that are raised by the person who asked the question. And I think it'll be, once having that standard tested in other places will help provide the reassurance that we need to make sure that these programs are implemented in a way that not only helps address climate change, but also is respectful of Indigenous rights.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Debbie, a question for you. Given how integrated agriculture supply chains are across North America, do you have any plans to expand into Canada?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we do. We're scaling here, or we're launching our market in 2020, and after that we will be looking to scaling into other parts of North America. And we do have members who operate obviously on both sides of the border. Some of our big corporates who are really eager for that to happen as well. So both producers and sellers and buyers are looking for us to do that. Canada will be next, which is the good news, after our 2022 launch.
Great, thanks, Debbie. Looking forward to seeing that expansion. Another question from our predominantly Canadian-based audience that is for both Brian and Michelle. Do you envision collaborating with the Canadian Clean Fuel Initiative that is scheduled to commence in 2021?
I guess I'll say I sure hope so. We're obviously, as I described, active in the United States. I hope that the Clean Fuel Standard will come out in a way that provides incentives to green the transportation network that's competitive with with what's happening elsewhere? And if so, we will be bringing product to Canada. I would like to just mention something, you know, it's quite a dichotomy. You heard about the different prices in transportation versus other sectors of the economy. In some way, that's driven by the broad view that we have to tackle transportation. And one of the things the low carbon fuel standard does is essentially provide a balanced signal across a whole set of solutions, including electricity. And in some ways, you can think of these prices as being gated on what is necessary to bring electric vehicles to market.
I imagine my colleagues will be engaged and certainly be supportive of that. I have colleagues that are working on greenhouse gas reductions and climate policy in Canada, so I imagine that we would be engaged.
Great, thank you. Let's see, just scrolling through some of the other questions. I see a question just asking if the existence of an emission cap is in fact a deterrent to emissions since it costs emitters money. Pretty general question there. Any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd like to offer a view on that. It's really, of course, an emissions cap costs emitters money, and it may even threaten their license to operate, so to speak. But it's very important to realize that emitters look at policy tools governments use with a great skepticism. Investors often say, I don't want to take a risk on policy changes. Policies can always change. And I think you need to be very careful in setting a target. Let's imagine Canada were to aggressively set a target, I don't know, to be 100% EVs by 2035. And we said, this is our goal. As I think we've seen time and again with other such goals, sometimes you can achieve them, but the only way to achieve them is to have incremental targets on a year-by-year basis and to have economic signals on the margin for market players to be able to act and to know they'll act. And it's also very important that people in industry don't feel that their most cost-effective option to deal with these kinds of government-based targets are to invest in government relations. And certainly throughout the Western world, government relations investments have been a common approach to dealing with targets.
Great, thanks. Here's a question to Debbie, actually. I'm blending a few questions here, but several of them just sort of come down to trust in results and any emissions that still may be happening that are not necessarily being accounted for. So how are you able to verify and trust the results of the carbon management practices that you're measuring?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're working with Gold Standard, which is a global certification body and carbon registry, if you will, to certify not only our protocols and our program, but all assets that are generated. So Michelle spoke to not only the social safeguards, but the entire suite of safeguards built into the registry process. It's actually quite a rigorous process you go through. What we are doing to really help track what's happening over time is to collect that data and be able to point to what happens over time. So watch the trends. What in each particular region or each particular production system, what are the systems approaches that move the needle the most, and then track them to ensure that the outcomes and the impacts we saw when we reported the emission reductions are actually continuing forward. So ours isn't just a one and done. We're actually, our entire effort is really ensuring we can continue to scale the impact by monitoring. And that's why we're investing in the technologies to better quantify and verify and then track emissions and impact over time.
Certainly trust in the results is a key component. Let's see. Here's an interesting question for all of you. What happens if Trump gets reelected? How would that impact the markets that you're working on and the development plans that you may have?
I can start. I worked in carbon markets going back to the 90s, and the reason I'm now working on a private voluntary market is that very reason, right? Is like, we do need private market signals. We need activities that can continue outside of like administrative swings, legislative opportunities. We were originally also focusing on federal investments, which are also really difficult to predict over time. This is why we're ultimately focused on the voluntary markets, if you will, that are credible, that are transparent, but that are not subject, if you will, to the whims of administration changes, which is a real threat.
Where you go, Michelle?
I went first last time, so.
Okay. I guess I think that the best thing I could do is to say that Donald Trump has promised to undermine initiatives in to fight climate change. You can read directly into that. He's promised to try to lower standards. He's done that in many instances. I think that we can anticipate, if he's reelected, that the U.S. federal programs will provide less of an incentive than even they currently do now, and they've stepped well back from where they were 4 years ago. We'll just have to see. We play I feel like saying the U.S. market and the California market, which are both radically different, as well as in Europe. And it would be nice to see robust markets around for fighting climate change and transportation, but I don't think we'll see that with Donald Trump.
I'll just add that we need action at all scales, no matter what. And so regardless of what happens in this election, I mean, I think we even see this at a global level. We need to accelerate action to reduce emissions. You know, the Paris Agreement and the goal there is great, but we still need to do more. And it needs action both from the private sector, but also at the subnational level. And we see that emerging now, right, with all the corporations making commitments and pledges to reduce emissions, and also all of the action at the subnational level that's emerging. And I think that will continue, irrespective of what happens in this next election, and we'll need to regardless. So I would anticipate that action will keep going, and we need it anyway.
Great. One lightning round question before we run out of time. It was an amendment to a previous question or a response. Just Brian, to counter the point that emitters can keep emitting when there is a cap on carbon. And so some people would argue that carbon credits don't work. So,
well, the core is that it's a price signal to reduce your emissions.
Right.
So is it true that the transportation industry is still emitting even with the low carbon fuel standard? Yeah, but they're emitting 10% less. And on the margin, there's strong signals for all the players to figure out how to take that 10% to 11% and 12% and 13%. Yep. That's what market signals do.
Thanks, Brian. Jeff, over to you for, I'm sorry, actually, let me say thank you, everybody. I really appreciate this discussion. We're out of time. I'm sorry that there are questions that we didn't get to, but we have loved the back and forth and the dialogue, and I am so appreciative to my panelists for taking the time out of your day to do this. So, Jeff, I'm turning it back over to you.
Thanks very much, Mary, and I just want to echo what you just said, which is what a wonderful panel, and sadly that's all the time we have for today, but thank you for leading the discussion, Mary, and managing the questions. If any of the people who are registered would like to connect with any of the panelists, you see my email address there, so send me an email and I will provide an e-introduction to the panelists. I want to thank our overall webinar platinum sponsor, EqualStrat, and I particularly want to thank today's session host, Iogen Corporation, for hosting today's session. And thanks to our panelists and our audience, and thanks to our technical team of Jake and Eva. Please note that next week's webinar, very intriguing and provocative subject, social and environmental justice, relevant to the bioeconomy or just noise. So that will be on October 6th at 11 a.m. Eastern, and it's hosted by AJW. This is Jeff Passmore signing off. See you next week. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.